Nomination rejection. Lawmakers voting no on Governor Hochul's pick for the state's next top judge. We have reaction and the possible next steps in the process. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Questions remain on exactly what happens now as the Senate Judiciary Committee voted down Governor Hochul's choice for the state's next chief judge, Judge Hector LaSalle. Capitol correspondent Jamie Line spoke with a New York State Constitution expert to get his take on the issue.
Judge Hector LaSalle was nominated for New York's top judge position by Governor Kathy Hochul. This sparked concerns among some members in her own party, who said he was too conservative.
10 opposed and 7 without recommendation. The nomination is lost.
New York Constitution expert and lawyer Christopher Bopes explained the significance of Wednesday's hearing outcome.
This was the first time that a nominee did not actually get a floor vote.
Now, does that go against the state constitution at all? Is this allowed to be done by the committee?
Well, that's really the $64,000 question, Jamie.
He says some argue that a provision in the Constitution giving the legislature authority to set its own rules allows the Senate committee to kill the nomination. Others believe that certain language in the Constitution and judiciary law requires confirmation or rejection by the entire Senate in a floor vote, not just a committee vote. In a statement, Hochul said in part, quote, several senators stated how they were going to vote before the hearing even began, including those who were recently given seats on the newly expanded Judiciary Committee. While the committee plays a role, we believe the Constitution requires action by the full Senate. There has been talk about Hochul possibly suing. I asked the governor's office about this, but was referred to her statement. When asked by reporters about this on Wednesday and whether or not the Senate would do the same, this is what Senator Hoylman-Siegel said.
I wouldn't know the answer to that, but I hope that litigation is, is not our future. It would, again, it's obviously the governor's decision, but we have so much work to do in Albany to be distracted by a lawsuit.
In Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
To give us additional insight following the rejection of Judge LaSalle's nomination, we're joined by Assemblyman Phil Steck of District 110. Assemblyman, thanks for joining us.
Ryan, thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this, because for a lot of people on the outside of the state looking in here, I've heard a lot of people almost call this an embarrassment, because as we've been reporting, the governor knew going into this hearing, the questioning, that she had a lot of these senators in her open. Now, granted, you're in the other chamber, but a lot of your colleagues were dead set against this nomination from the get-go.
Well, this is an interesting thing. I think Judge LaSalle and the governor are actually paying the price for the judicial appointments of the prior governor, which were routinely confirmed by the Senate, and the general consensus was that they were not in sync with the viewpoints of a majority of Democrats in the state. So I think the Senate got tired of being a rubber stamp. They do have a constitutional role to fulfill, and they were looking for more say in the process. And I think that's certainly legitimate. In my 10 years in the New York State Assembly, we have never overridden a gubernatorial veto. Not once.
That almost astonishes me.
Yes, it's part of the democratic process. And why we yield to the governor, there is a reason, because New York, unlike any other state, gives the governor control over the budget. And the governor can use that to sort of bludgeon the legislature into submission, and people don't want to get that into that confrontation. So it gives the governor, which has huge power anyway, even more power.
And we were talking earlier, you reminded me that it wasn't that long ago that the state elected judges to the State Court of Appeals. They are now gubernatorial appointees.
Yeah, and that was one of the reforms that the so-called good government groups wanted, because their vision was that all the judges were picked by political parties, and that's a terrible thing. But in fact, when we had a Court of Appeals that was elected, the New York State Court of Appeals was then one of the leading courts in the country in terms of the quality of its opinions, and they took more cases than they do now. So the thing about elected judges at that level is they're truly independent of the governor and of the legislature. They're their own separately elected officials, and I think we've lost that independence with gubernatorially appointed judges because judges at the appellate division level know if they want to get higher, they got to be in the good graces of the governor.
Now, you're an attorney. You've been practicing law for a few decades now. How important is this process, and how important is it, and you touched on it a little bit there, for these judges to remain of independent mind?
Well, I'm a civil rights attorney, which is kind of an unusual specialty here in the Capital Region. When I go to court, I want one thing. I want judges that will follow the law, not their personal preference if it's in conflict with the law. And I think that if you were a client, you would want that too. I think there is a concern that a lot of the judges today, particularly on the United States Supreme Court, are throwing the law to the four winds and doing what they think is best. And I think that's very damaging to the judicial system. And I think the role of the Senate in confirming judges, and I'm not casting aspersions on Judge LaSalle per se, but they have a role to make sure that the judges who get to that level don't have some sort of agenda. And again, I felt the feeling was that the Cuomo Court of Appeals had an agenda of its own.
So the big question now is, where do we go from here? And there's this rumor that perhaps the governor is thinking of suing, that this requires the vote of the entire Senate rather than just a committee. But really, what are the next steps for her to take?
I find it humorous because if the governor sues on this, who makes the decision? Judges appointed by the governor. The last time we had a constitutional conflict of that nature, the judges of the Court of Appeals, which were appointed by then Governor Pataki, ruled in favor of Governor Pataki. Big surprise there. I think this is, I think it's a mistake for the governor to bring a lawsuit about this, because the Senate does have a constitutional role to play, and there's nothing wrong with the governor having negotiated with the Senate to make sure her choice would be confirmed. That's part of the process to assure that the judges of the Court of Appeals are acceptable to a wider range of public opinion than just the viewpoint of the governor.
Do we see her possibly doing just that? Maybe going back to the drawing board and sitting down with the senators and coming to some sort of consensus? Or
I've only been in the legislature under one governor who jealously guarded every ounce of power that he had and tried to add to it at every possible turn. I think it takes a governor with a real respect for the democratic process not to be that way. And, you know, governors, I've heard from members who served a lot longer than I do, all governors like to protect the power of their office. Sure. But, my opinion of this governor is she does work collaboratively with the legislature, certainly far more than the prior governor did. And as chair of the Committee on Alcoholism and Substance Abuse, I find this governor extremely receptive to some of the things that need to be done in that field. So I do think she has a history of being collaborative, and I hope that will win out.
Time will tell.
Yes.
Assemblyman Phil Steck, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. As the price of consumer goods continues to surge, financially struggling families may one day see their wages rise with it. Hear from an economic expert when we come back on the benefits of Governor Hochul's plan to tie the minimum wage to inflation. And as always, if you've got a comment, story idea, please let us know. You can email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. As families across the state continue to pay more for everything due to record inflation, a plan proposed during the State of the State address would tie New York's minimum wage to the inflation rate. Now, under that plan proposed by Governor Hochul, each year the state's minimum wage would increase based on the consumer price index for wage earners for the Northeast region. Protections would be put in place to cap annual increases so they wouldn't get out of control. The governor argues that indexing the minimum wage to inflation would maintain the purchasing power of workers' wages year to year.
Like other states that have implemented this policy, we'll put on guardrails to make sure employers, the increases are predictable for them. I understand this. We also need to have flexibility in the event of a recession. But this important change will give over 900,000 minimum wage workers a lifeline.
And we're joined now by Professor Brad Lewis, an economics professor at Union College, to talk a little bit more about the governor's plan. Professor Lewis, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes. Good morning.
So the governor's plan here is to tie minimum wage to inflation. Sir, from your experience, what kind of thing will this accomplish, this move? Is this a good thing to do here?
We're talking about the minimum wage in New York State and whether it should be indexed. And I'll start with 2 points. The first one is very simple, that one of the advantages of doing that and tying it to the CPI or some other index of prices is that we'd have some ability for firms and everybody else to try to be able to plan, because they'd have some sense of how it would work given what they think is going to happen.
And of course, there's great concern from small businesses and especially the agriculture sector here in New York State. We're seeing record high inflation. Things cost more for us, but it's also more expensive for small businesses and farmers to do business. And the last thing they're worried about is having to pay their employees more as well.
Well, it's certainly the case that now we're having a ignition of inflation, and I don't think that it's going to immediately go down. Essentially, if you keep up with inflation, you're probably not going to have too much of a problem, because employers might very well have to pay that anyway. And again, they would have some sense of what's going on. I would not be surprised, however, if in a couple of years we were back down to 2%, or maybe not, because there's one other thing that's here, and it's really starting to be important. And the importance is simply that we have a smaller labor force and a relatively young one, and more retirees. So we're already seeing some of the effects of that. That is to say, labor shortages. And when you have labor shortages, guess what? Wages go up.
And there's a lot of details of the governor's plan that unfortunately are still unclear at this point. But from what we understand, there is a quote unquote off-ramp figured in here, so that there is a cap at some point that, forbid we ever end up in a situation where inflation is once again running rampant, that then wages aren't running as sky high with it. And a lot of people have expressed that maybe right now isn't the time to move forward with something like this until we're a little bit more sure that the inflation gets a little bit more under control.
Well, I actually think that it's a good time to do it, yes, we've had some significant inflation and some problems coping with it. But I think that, you know, there's always a temptation in the minimum wage to go very high, and supposedly that's going to help the working people. But the problem is that it's not going to help if you're going to not have a job in the first place. And I will certainly say that for upstate New York, we have a different situation in quite a few of the places. And at the same time, interestingly, you have the capital region, which, and certainly in Schenectady 20 years ago was very, very different than it is now, because we have a lot of important industry and so forth. So we're already having more, higher wage place. So that's something that's a reality. In other places out that are not doing so well, that will be a problem. But I don't think we're likely to go back to really low wages in those places if they're going to work very well.
Professor Brad Lewis, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, the legal battle continues over changes made to New York's gun laws. When we return, how a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court is impacting how those laws will be carried out as litigation continues. And remember, got a comment, story idea? Please let us know. Email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or seek us out on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Legal challenges to New York's concealed carry law continue. U.S. Supreme Court ruling that the law as is can remain in place while lawsuits move through the court system. Capitol correspondent Amel Taleji has more now.
This past summer, the Supreme Court struck down New York's century-old concealed carry law, saying proper cause was in fact not needed to keep and bear arms in public. Since then, state lawmakers have created a series of legislation to work around the ruling, including creating a sensitive locations measure. This states that for even those who have their license, they cannot carry in specific locations. Some have criticized the new law, saying it infringes on their Second Amendment rights. In October, a federal judge agreed and issued a temporary restraining order saying multiple parts of the legislation are unconstitutional, which the Supreme Court rescinded. Tom King, executive director of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, says he thinks the Supreme Court is waiting for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals to determine where they stand on this matter. King says he thinks the lawsuit brought to the Supreme Court may be too broad.
So I don't think this is any kind of a statement on the Supreme Court's position on the Second Amendment. I think it was a statement based on the case itself and where they want to go from this point forward.
Part of the new gun laws also enhances safe storage requirements and background checks on all ammunition purchases. In a statement, Attorney General Letitia James says, quote, "Once again, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided to allow our state's gun safety laws to remain in effect. We know that gun safety laws help save lives and keep our state safer." We'll have the latest on any litigation involving New York state gun laws. Reporting in Albany, Amel Taleji.
New legislation could soon bring civil and criminal charges to storefronts operating in a legal gray area. So-called sticker stores, as they're known, sell cannabis illegally, but attempt to skirt the laws by selling customers a sticker, then giving away the marijuana as a, quote, donation. A representative with the State Office of Cannabis Management says these stores not only take sales away from the legitimate market, they also pose a real risk to customers.
New York State has some of the most strict testing requirements for cannabis that will be on the retail shelves in licensed locations. These illicit unlicensed locations that are operating as sticker shops are dealing in cannabis that has not been tested to our strict regulation.
Stick around. We'll be back with a look ahead, a week ahead, in just a moment. Remember, got a comment, story idea, let us know. Email empirestateweekly@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. All right, and finally from us here on Empire State Weekly, we are following the ongoing response to the opioid crisis. Recent data from the State Department of Health shows more than 4,700 people died due to an overdose last year. The number of opioid-related ER visits also increased. We'll continue to follow the state's latest efforts to help those struggling with substance abuse issues. For now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. We'll see you back here next week. Don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here is our full schedule of where you can catch it on 10 television stations across New York.